I'm a psychoanalyst in private practice. I'm an author. I write books about parenting, and the book I'm probably most well known for is my book, Being There, and it's basically about the neuroscience of attachment, or the importance of mothers in the first 3 years of a child's life to create emotional security, which lays down the foundation for mental health in the future. And so from my perspective, I guess the conversation we're going to have, I should say right off the bat, I consider myself a feminist. But I consider myself a term that I like better and that my community uses, the people that I work with, and which is I consider myself a maternal feminist. Basically, there was a school of thought called maternal feminism, which really elevated women in their work as mothers and really talked about it as very important work. And so I'm not an anti-feminist, and I'm certainly for women to have choice. So it'll be an interesting discussion. I guess you could say I'm more of a centrist on this topic. As Louise said, there are parts of feminism that I think really helped women, and there are parts that really did a lot of harm to children. Freedom is a wonderful thing. No one would want to take freedom away from human beings, but excessive freedom without structure is not good for human beings. So I'll use the example because I talk about children a lot. If you raise your children with respect for their will, that is a good thing, right? You don't want to quash their will. You want to support their individuality and support their choices. And even when raising children, you're going to give them choices. Do you want eggs or waffles for breakfast? Do you want to wear your green pants or your blue pants? No more than that with small children. But if you don't provide any structure for them, they don't feel loved, they don't feel secure, they don't feel stable. And so what I'm afraid of is that we went too far. It's not that freedom isn't a good thing. It's that excessive freedom without any structure at all can also make us feel untethered, unbound, without connections to the people that we're most intimate with. And that's my concern. So first of all, I don't agree with you. If I can just say that I don't agree that we are encouraging monogamy. I think we're encouraging polygamy. And I don't mean marriage polygamy. I mean multiple partners. Young people are hooking up. I wrote an article for the Institute for Family Studies on why and the statistics on the hookup culture and what it's doing to young people in terms of their mental health. It's causing them to feel more depressed, more anxious, more embarrassed, having more regrets, self-esteem issues. It's got some major implications, and we're talking the statistics say 72 to 82%, 72% of young men and 82% of women, young women are feeling depressed and anxious after these casual sexual encounters. Tinder has an ad that says, "Meet the love of your night." What it does is it takes something so sacred and intimate, and it turns it into something not just casual, but it turns it into something irrelevant, unimportant, and dangerous, if you ask me, emotionally dangerous. And it can be physically dangerous. If you're having casual sex, you could get a sexually transmitted disease. AIDS is still around. I think in a way, what we've taught our kids and what I encourage the young people that I work with is that experiment with sex. Care about the people that you're experimenting with. Find people who care about you and who you care about. So that's structure. But young women, young men who are developing emotionally, mentally.
Should not have the right.
No.
They shouldn't have the right.
Can I finish?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, sorry. So you interrupted, so I didn't get to finish.
I'm so sorry.
Okay. So they're more vulnerable. They are more vulnerable emotionally to what the hookup culture does to them. There's a lot of research to say that it causes loneliness, depression, anxiety, tons of regret, embarrassment, shame, self-esteem issues. And so, of course, we want freedom. In fact, I'm probably more in agreement with you on most things than you think. But in this, I say that freedom can become its own prison. So if you think about the early feminists, the really early feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, those women were fighting patriarchy. They were fighting a system that said they had to be a certain way. So of course I don't accept what Iran does to women. I mean, that, but what's happened is if the pendulum swings too far, you have a different kind of patriarchy on the other side. We say the extreme left and the extreme right actually meet in the middle. And so have we just we never want to take choice away. The idea of taking choice away from women to have sex with whoever they want to have sex with, that's not the point of this. It's, have we created a society which pressures young women in its own way to be promiscuous, to have lots of experiences? It's not all glorious, freedom. It is glorious, but it's also not all glorious. And it can be a pressure on young people to get rid of their virginity, to have lots of sexual experiences. And it's not all it's cracked up to be for them. It really isn't. In terms of their mental health, again, they are more, we say 9 to 25, really 27 in young men, is the second critical period of brain development, where they are very susceptible to their relational experiences and their environment. And so in that period of development, which is mostly what we use the term hookup culture for, it's in that very young developmental period. It's not just in college, it's throughout their 20s, until that woman becomes 32. That's a very vulnerable brain. And so we have created a culture that confuses that brain, that offers too many choices, that pressures them into having multiple partners and many experiences, and leaves them feeling empty and lonely. Can I just interject and just say that you're right in turning to me and saying I didn't mean that you have to marry your first partner, but there's something very important about the emotional connection. And that's coming from maybe me being a therapist and knowing and seeing the pain that the young people who come to me are in when there's no emotional connection and they give their bodies over. By the way, young men too. I think it's shifting, actually. It's interesting what I'm seeing in my practice. Young men are more vulnerable than women now. Women have taken on the role that young men used to have emotionally. And so, women have all these choices, and now they're leaving young men in the dust, and the young men are feeling lonely, and, they have sex with a girl and they want to date her, and she says, no, I'm sleeping with 5 guys at the same time. And these are kids in their 20s. But sex is better with emotional connection. That doesn't mean you have to marry the first guy that you have sex with. I also want to say that there is something called neurotic repetition. A lot of the early feminists had a lot of trauma. You had trauma. A lot of people have had trauma. And what happens with trauma is it tends to be like PTSD. If we have disconnection early on, or abuse, or violence against us, attachment disorders, as I've talked about in your other podcasts when you're very young, it gets reenacted and repeated throughout your life over and over and over and over again. So interestingly, the early feminists were mostly traumatized women. If you look at the histories of them, they had physically abusive fathers, alcoholic fathers. They had uncles who raped them. They had, terrible, even their mothers too. Just really abusive parents, but mostly the men in their life were horrible. And so a lot of this whole experience depends on where you come from and what you had. If you've had good models, it's why I sort of talk about, I'm writing a book about divorce. Why am I writing a book about divorce if I believe in relationships? Because divorce is going to happen and we need to help parents to know how to raise healthy children in spite of it. But relationships matter. They matter in the raising of children. So when we have a disconnected society where we say relationships don't matter, just sex matters. Sex, sex, sex. Of course sex matters. But what I say to young people is sex is a very small part of a relationship. It really is, because in the beginning it's hot, hot, hot. And then as you get to know each other and you have the daily comings and goings of life, it's the friendship, it's the connection, it's the companionship, it's the relationship. But if you've had a lot of trauma, then you are not going to turn towards relationships, and you are not going to turn towards men. If men traumatized you and you saw a man abuse your mother, of course you're not going to want men in your life. So a lot of it, I think the feminist movement does something which it's first of all, I'm going to say it's done a lot of good. I wouldn't be here. None of us would be here without it. Those women that took the risks, we have to be grateful toward. But I mean, what it also did is it distorted a lot of the importance of relationships and how important male and female relationships are. I'll stop there because I've talked too much, but
with more.
I do want to separate young people from what you were talking about, adult women. I want to separate them because they're not the same species. There's so much development going on in adolescence. And adolescence, as I said, goes on till 25. So by the time you're an adult woman, you are, for the most part, developed. By the time you get to 32, there's going to be stuff going on, but the major part of your personality and character development is pretty much set. And so that developing period is really more my concern. It's not that I'm not concerned about my older patients who come to me and talk about how free sex and, multiple partners makes them feel good. I would say, great, it's your choice. If that makes you feel good, wonderful. But in young people where they're developing, I agree with you that we need more education. I'm all for more education, but I'm for so we have so much sex education right now in schools, too much sex education, if you ask me. We're teaching 9-year-olds about anal sex. We're teaching them about genital warts. That's not something a 9-year-old needs to know, in school. So, but I think we're not teaching them about emotional connection, about relationships, about family, about the arc of a life. That if you want to be single and you want to have multiple partners and you want to be free, that's your choice. I have no problem with that. But we're not teaching about the importance of connection and emotional connection and building families. And so what do we have? We have a bunch of young people out there who are having sex but feeling empty and lonely and depressed and anxious and not knowing why. Because we are teaching sex, but we're not teaching about connection.
Can I also say, and I don't know that it's true that in the UK that we're teaching 9-year-olds about anal, by the way, but the thing that's lacking in sex education often here is pleasure. They do not talk about how pleasurable it can be, or that girls should be, when they have their first sexual experience, ideally as young women, that are not girls, but of course they should be young women, they should be of age, that their pleasure matters. There's so many young women who at the first just go, I guess I have to do this, and he has to find pleasure in it. But learning what makes your own body feel pleasure is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Knowing that it can give you great intimacy and it can be a lifelong relationship partner and all
so
of those things.
So that's a 1950s idea. The 1950s were a time, nobody wants to go back to the 1950s. When the books that I write, people come up to me and they say, you want women to go back to being pregnant and barefoot in the kitchen. I'm like, what? No, we don't want to go back to the 50s because women didn't have choice and women didn't know about orgasm and they didn't know about, that sex could be pleasurable. And so we don't want to go back. We want to move forward. We want to take the best of, the highlights of the past and not leave all of the good parts of the past behind and, take the good parts of the feminist movement too. But there's a lot of it that's not so good. And I'm going to agree with Louise that there are so many young women and older women, but let's just say young women.
Don't point at me and say older women.
No, I'm old too. Older, over 32.
I'll admit to over 32, Erica, and that's all I can give you.
But that's all we're doing. That's all we're doing. You're older than 25. There are so many young women who are looking to understand the secret sauce. What is going to make them the happiest? I don't love the word happy, but I think our young people are so very unhappy. They have never been so unhappy. The statistics on mental illness and unhappiness and loneliness we have all the sexual freedom, We have all of these feminist ideals, and yet young women are so very unhappy.
History.
So I actually think what does bear out is that human beings universally, from birth, crave security. We know that. They crave safety and security and stability from birth. And we don't teach that. We say just be impulsive, be in the moment. And I think that's a lot of what's causing the unhappiness, is that we don't help educate and strategize what a good life means to you. Now, maybe for you, a good life is just being free and, having a great career. And I have no problem with that. I'm the first one to say the women's movement gave women choice to have the life they want to have. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of women who feel bullied by this narrative of freedom. They feel bullied by it. And I hear it in my practice. I see it online on my, my Instagram following and people writing. And you're right, I have a particular lens, so people may come to me because of that. But what I will say is that the feminist movement, at least the second wave of the feminist movement, was a little bit of a cabal in a sense that it was a small group of women saying every woman should feel this way. Every woman should want to go out to work and leave their children in daycare. Every woman should want free sex. And the bottom line is a lot of women don't. A lot of women want the choice to be respected, to have intimate and loving and marital relationships and monogamy. And they want to be able to stay home with their children and have society say, you are amazing, and admire them for it. And what I know is that there's a lot of young women and adult women who are feeling pressured to live a life that isn't making them happy, that is without relationships, that's without having one intimate partner, that is, freedom without any limits.
Because this subject of manosphere has been at the very forefront of conversation.
Everything's a little out of balance. Everything's a little out of whack. So it was out of whack in the 50s. And so we fixed it. And now it's out of whack in a different way. We went from the patriarchy of men dominating women to now we have the patriarchy of women dominating men. I mean, what we need to do is not go back, but come to the middle. We need to, it just makes common sense.
How are we dominating men, though?
Oh, my goodness. 60% of college students are women. And graduate students.
That's not us dominating men, though.
Well, let me finish. Young men are afraid of women and the power they have over them to accuse. No, it's true. In universities, it's a real thing. I know because I have two sons. And, there is, again, the correction was necessary. We needed to course correct in society. Absolutely. But we've gone so far. So the men were powerful and the women weren't. So the women said, give us some power. So now the women took the power and now the men feel powerless. You need a society that's balanced. It needs to be balanced. And the idea was that where we wanted to go, and the truth is that all movements often go to extremes. The women's movement, those women had to go to extremes because to change society, you have to do that, right?
So should some women not go to university? Is that what you're saying?
No, but actually I think there needs to be a balance in society of men and women. If we say that we are going to be like Amazon women and not need men anymore, the truth is that the way it works is that by the research is that women will marry at their educational level or above, and men will marry at their educational level or below. That means that because we have fewer men in college and graduate school, women are not finding partners.
I'm just going to jump in there and talk about a report that came out in 2025, which sent shockwaves across the UK. It was called the Lost Boys Report. I think we might have talked about this in a previous episode, but it was a report by the Centre of Social Justice, which highlighted how many young men are now struggling in school, facing increased mental health problems and lacking positive role models, leaving them lost and isolated. And as a result, they suggested that many of them are turning to what we call the manosphere. And to give a definition to the manosphere, because I didn't actually know what it was, the definition I have from Cambridge Dictionary is manosphere includes websites and discussion groups focused on men's rights, which often oppose feminism in some way. And just to give a sort of a top line look at some of the stats around this, by age 5, 25% of boys in the UK are falling behind in language communication skills compared to just 14% of women. Yeah. At GCSE level, boys' results are on average half a grade lower than girls. The same applies for mental health and wellbeing. Obviously, we know about the suicide rates in young men, with nearly 3.5. They're nearly 3.5 times higher than those of young women. Eating disorders have risen as well in young men. And from an employment perspective, as of late 2024, 15.1% of men aged 16 to 24 were not in education, compared to 11% of women, which equates in the UK to about 550,000 men. And lastly, young women are between the age of 16 and 24 now earn nearly 10% more than their male peers, reversing the traditional gender pay gap in this age group. And I could go on and on and on. Specifically, the things that I've kind of not talked about are just how family dynamics have changed. And by age 14, nearly half of firstborn children do not live with both natural parents compared to 1970. And this was really shocking. And I think it really rose an argument, which I saw play out in, I saw the Sunday Times do a big piece about it. I saw it on LinkedIn, which is what is going on here? And is this a clue as to why we now have this term manosphere?
It's a reaction. Manosphere is a reaction to the pendulum swinging too far. The pendulum needed to swing, for sure.
Deborah, can I ask to that point then, on that partnership? As a man, I still kind of assume that a woman is more likely to choose me if I have more money than her and I can pay the bills and I take care of her. And so I looked into some of the research around that, and there's still an expectation amongst women that their male partner will earn much more than them. And when they did this big, I think it's about 70%, I'll put the right stat on the screen, when they did this big analysis of dating behavior, where they looked at 1.8 million online dating profiles across 20 different countries. If you earned more, so if you had higher income, you are 255% more likely to get an indication of interest on these applications. And so I would love to live in a world where that wasn't the case, but it seems that women are still choosing men that earn much more money. And that expectation of therefore being the provider is so inherent in reproductive success as a man.
There's a reason for that, though. So what we haven't talked about, can we talk about children now?
Sure, we can talk about whatever you like. Yeah.
If you want to raise children and be the primary attachment figure for your children, and it's usually the mother, sometimes it's the father now, but it's still usually the mother. Children need a primary attachment figure as present as possible in the first 3 years if they are going to be mentally healthy in the future. All of the research shows that. If you're going to be as physically present as possible, unless you've saved a lot of money as a woman, you need to depend on your partner, on your team member. My husband and I were a team. Before we had children, we both earned a lot and worked really hard and spent our money equally. But then we decided, it was a strategy, we were going to have children, and I was going to work as little as possible so I could be there for them. And he did the bulk of the earning. And now the joke is, I'm out in the world and I'm going to be taking over and he's going to be sitting by the pool, and I'd be fine with that. But that's what teamwork is. But the idea that I could lean on my husband financially in those years and not have to earn money and be able to be present for my children, there is a very good reason why that is critical for children. And we don't talk about children. We're sitting here, this is the first time we talked about children. We're talking about adults. And individuals. And no, children are dependent on us. If you don't have to have children to be happy, but if you are going to bring children into this world, you have a responsibility to those children, and it surpasses any individual desire you may have.
And you're saying the mother should be there in those opening years?
The primary attachment figure, who's usually the mother. Daycare is terrible for children. Let's define daycare. Daycare is anything under the age of 3. Otherwise, we call it preschool. We used to call it nursery school, 3 to 5 before kindergarten. Okay. So anything under the age of 3 where you put your child in group care is daycare. And what it really is, they're day orphanages. You separate a baby who needs skin-to-skin contact, the sound of their mother's voice, her eyes, her physical and emotional presence to soothe that baby when they're in distress from moment to moment, to help to regulate their emotions. So 2 things mothers do. They buffer children from stress, which is so important because the part of their brain that regulates stress is meant to remain offline for the first year and very quietly, slowly come online for the next 2 years. So what are we doing? We're throwing babies into these institutional orphanages. It's overstimulating. It's stressful. If you walk into any daycare, you are going to hear many, many children crying. Children are not meant to cry much in the first year. They're meant to be held by their mothers and held against their mothers' bodies. So they buffer children from stress and they regulate their emotions. So what we're seeing as a mental health crisis is a crisis of emotional regulation issues in children, adolescents, and adults. Depression, anxiety, ADHD, these are all emotional regulation issues. That means people cannot regulate their emotions. And so we're just giving them pills. We're not saying, where does emotional regulation come from? What's the origin of it? And the origin of it is in the very early days of your life. If you had a mother who soothed you when you were in distress from moment to moment, it regulates your emotions. So it's only after 3, 85% of the right brain is developed by 3. It's only after 3 that you start to internalize the ability to regulate your own emotions or to deal with stress and adversity in the future.
So does that mean that if I'm not home as a mother for those early 3 years, you think there's possible chances that my child might grow up to be somewhat traumatized or have some kind of...
It is not what nature intended for us. And so we have made social changes that are about narcissism and self-orientation and me, and don't involve an understanding of children's irreducible developmental needs. And if we did, then maybe more women wouldn't have children, and that would be fine. I have no problem. I'm not a pro-natalist. You don't have to have children to be happy. You can, build businesses, build houses, have loving, intimate relationships, not have children. But if you're going to have children, you need to know that dropping and running, putting them in daycare, or now, let's talk about very poor women, because this is always going to come back at me. What about very poor women? There are so many solutions for very poor women that do not involve daycare. And I hate when people say poor women have to rely on daycare. Why should they have to rely on daycare when rich women don't have to rely on daycare? And the truth is there are other solutions. Poor women can live together and support one another and form communities. They can share care of a caregiver. It's far better to have a single surrogate attachment figure, a babysitter who is a full-time babysitter, than putting a child in daycare. So if you can't be there and you're poor and you have to work, then it's far better to have first kinship bonds, someone who's related to you, because it's going to be a more similar investment in that child than anyone else. Secondly, a single surrogate caregiver, a babysitter or nanny. If you can't afford it, share the care with another mother, because that's still going to be better for that child than putting them into an institutional group environment. Because what you're doing is you're basically putting usually no less than 5 children with one caregiver under the age of 3. In some cases, it's under the age of 1. And if you've ever had a baby crying, you know that that baby is going to get the other babies crying. And now you have 5 babies crying. There's no way you can soothe them when they're in distress. There's no way you can regulate all those babies' emotions. We are doing terrible damage to our children by putting them in daycare. Now, daycare was the feminist agenda. It was about the second wave of feminism. They said, put your babies in daycare. It's the only way you're going to go back to work and work. And they didn't talk about children. The first wave of feminists, they talked about children. Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft, they believed that mothering was powerful work. It was work. It was a career. It was admired. It was elevated. They also believed in fighting the patriarchy. They believed in equality, but they didn't forget about mothering. The second wave of feminists, I think it was Betty Friedan said that staying at home with your children she called it a concentration camp with comforts. That was the beginning of the tide. That's when the tide turned for women, where the narrative changed. So women who were loving being mothers and loving raising children suddenly were told that they were in a concentration camp and that they were prisoners and oppressed. And some of them were, and some of them probably shouldn't have had children, and many of them weren't. And even today, people write me every day and say, thank you for saying what you say, because society's narrative is so much about we have no value unless we go out into the workforce.
So Cass don't want to go back to men are from Mars and women are from Venus.
No, I want to give some evidence of that. So there is hormonal research to show that men and women respond to nurturing differently. We have different hormones, different amounts of hormones. It comes from different parts of our brain. Women produce when they give birth, when they breastfeed, when they nurture their young, they produce a ton of oxytocin if they're healthy. Oxytocin helps you to attach to your baby, and it also is inversely connected to cortisol. So it lowers the baby's stress, it lowers your stress, and it raises the well-being of the baby and the well-being in you. And so what we know is that oxytocin is passed back and forth between babies and mothers, right brain to right brain connection. Oxytocin makes mothers sensitive, empathic nurturers. It makes them very attuned to the distress of their babies. When fathers produce oxytocin, when they stay home, it comes from a different part of their brain, and it makes them more playful, tactile stimulators of babies. They tickle the babies, they throw them up in the air, they chase them around, they encourage risk-taking, they encourage exploration. They're great with separation. But in terms of providing that emotional security and that emotional regulation in those early days, mothers do it differently. Fathers produce a lot of vasopressin. It's called the protective aggressive hormone. There was a study that was done where fathers and mothers lay in bed together. It was done in the UK. And when the baby cried, almost nearly every time the mother woke up in the middle of the night to the baby's cries, and the father slept through it. But when there was, when there was a rustling of leaves outside the window, the fathers woke up and the mother slept through it because of the predatorial threat. We are wired. We are mammals. We are not better than mammals. We are mammals. And mammals have been doing this for millennium. And evolutionarily, there's a reason why we have different responses, different nurturing behaviors that are correlated with our hormones. We are not the same. We are equal in so many ways, but we are not the same in terms of our nurturing behaviors. That doesn't mean a father can't learn. It doesn't mean a father who wants to be the stay-at-home dad can't learn to be a sensitive, empathic nurturer. But if we can't acknowledge that we're different, then we can't teach what we need to teach. You said we need education. We need all kinds of education, but you can't educate a father that he's different than a mother if you're not admitting that he's different than a mother.
We are different.
With exceptions.
We're equal,
it's not
equal but different.
It's not men are from Mars, women from Venus. It's overlapping bell curves. Yeah. So there are outliers, but at the population level, which is what we're talking about, you have to acknowledge that there are differences.
Did you say that what was that number you cited? 66% of women would like the opportunity to be able to stay at home.
That's a UK figure. 60% in America, 66% in the UK.
I don't know the numbers on men, but I would guess that it's...
But that is not most people's experience. A lot of my friends tell me that effectively having a child is becoming an unpaid Uber driver for someone who doesn't want to go to karate and hates you anyway. And it's hard work.
But that is a narrative that I'm going to push back on, which is part of the problem, which is that it's the narrative of misery, which has been promoted. And it's not miserable to have children. It's joyful. It's the most incredible love you'll ever experience in your life, but it's also really hard. And I think we have a bunch of pussies, actually. Right. We are producing women and men who are pussies. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. They cannot deal with discomfort. They cannot deal with frustration. They cannot deal with sacrifice or hardship or responsibility. They want it to be easy. Who said raising children was easy? You don't get the good stuff unless you put in the work. And it's the same if you're out in the world. Of course, it's easier to go to a job than it is to stay home with a child because a child demands more of you, but it also gives back more. And I'm going to say this is not a binary equation here. So 66% may want to stay home, but they may want to stay home and have part-time work or do some work from home. It may not be as binary as you're making it out to be. It's not like you have to stay home for 3 years. And it's not an elitist idea. So can I just answer the guilt question? Because I didn't get to answer that because you said you're making a lot of women feel guilty. So guilt is actually quite a healthy emotion. In small supply, guilt is a very healthy. It means that your ego is functioning. So if we're not just preoccupied as women on our own needs and desires and self-orientation and narcissistic sort of wishes, then listen, then we have
really
to,
trying.
if we're not just concerned with ourselves, then when we leave our very, very, very young children, we should feel badly because those children need us. If we stop feeling badly for our children when we leave them, you break the bond. You can't turn off attachment. So A little bit of guilt means your ego is functioning. It's a good sign. Now, the response to that may not be that you can stay home with your children, even part-time, but at least it informs you. So whatever time you have with your children, you spend it wisely. I mean, I think it was Penelope Leach who said, well before me, that don't have children if you don't want to care for them, because you can have a very productive and creative life without having children. But if you're going to have children, you need to care for them. And they're your responsibility.
And I think that's a real trap for feminism, is to assume that women should want to be as much like men as possible.
Even women's bodies. Even if you look at teenage girls' bodies, they all aspire to be like adolescent boys. You know, they don't want breasts, they don't want hips, they want to be, right? So it's almost as if we elevated, in a funny way, feminists were trying to reject patriarchy, but they ended up idolizing it and wanting to be it, and then rejecting everything feminine. And that's a problem. And it's certainly a problem for motherhood.
And I think what maternal feminism says is, actually, maybe women are all right, and maybe actually this feminine stuff is good, and maybe motherhood is actually just as valuable as your professional life. And we should aspire to feminist ideas, policy, education, whatever, which prizes that.
And how much do you see women elevated who are mothers? I mean, do you go to a cocktail party and you ask a woman what she does, and she says, I'm a stay-at-home mom and I'm raising my children. The back will turn on her, whether it's a woman or a man. And so that means that we've denigrated and not just deprioritized. We've denigrated it, we've dismissed it, we've turned it into something less than. And so remember that what helped women to feel valuable in society was the admiration for them. Feminism has to get to a place where it says, you have choice. We admire your choice to stay home with your children, and admire our choice not to have children. But the idea that the second wave of feminism, it was about, it's all drudgery and it's disgusting and boring, and it made it into this. And now you have these websites, which are frightening to me, the scary mommy websites, where you have women saying, I hate breastfeeding and I hate pregnancy and I hate my children. And it's so disturbing to me, because what have we done to those women? What have we done to society that we have those websites? It's okay to feel frustrated, to feel bored, to have many feelings about mothering, but the hostility towards mothering, the hostility towards children, the hostility towards raising children, if we don't admire mothers again, there will be no mothers in the future.
Erica,
I agree on that.
Have we got you said something there which links to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is, if we don't correct this in some way, we're not going to have mothers. And when we look at the birth rates and the fertility rates,
50% of young women don't want to have children. So, again, I'm all for choice, and I think women have to come together. So in a way, the feminism movement didn't unite women, it split women. In many ways, the second wave of feminism. Women were historically, for millennium, the caretakers of a community, the community leaders. They would check on the elderly. They would feed the poor. They would take care of the children, right? So what happened is that we took them out of their caretaking roles, and it was like taking a keystone species out of the environment. Much of the environment degraded and shriveled up. That's why we're seeing 50%. That's why we're seeing, in my opinion, that's why we're seeing such a rise in mental illness. Women aren't going to check on their neighbors anymore. They're not feeding the poor at their local church. They're really preoccupied with making money and materialism and the GDP and a world in which they are no longer caretakers. Now, not everybody's meant to be a caretaker, but the point is, once we lose that linchpin, the society degrades.
The ecosystem.
It degrades.
Is that both sexes want the privileges without the responsibilities. And you see that within the manosphere as well. That's what the manosphere wants. They want all the privileges of masculinity without any of the responsibilities. They don't want to have to be the breadwinner for their families, or to do difficult work, or to risk their safety doing anything. And I'm afraid sometimes feminism is like this as well, that we expect women to be given, to be deferred to, and to be prioritized. But we say, I don't have time to do all this stuff for other people. That's ridiculous. I should be like writing TV shows. I mean, that's not the counterpart, right? Like writing TV shows is great, but it's not like essential work to society. Whereas raising children and protecting your community really is. And we do need people to do that with both sexes.
Problem is we can't put a price on it. And that's the problem, is that we can't put a price on how important it is to raise children. It's unpaid work. And because we focus so much in society on paid work, we can't put a price on how elevated women's work should be, meaning how elevated nurturing children should be in society. You know, I mean, my kids always say, again, I'm going to get a lot of hell for this too, but my kids always say, it's not fair that people in finance are earning all that money and doctors and nurses and social workers and teachers earn so little. And they used to say that when they were little. And I had a hard time explaining to them why that was. And all I could say was, the world is not a fair place. But that's not a very good response. And so, you know, I think the idea that we have shifted this narrative towards working out in the world and paid labor and accomplishments out in the world and achievements out in the world, as opposed to what's right in front of you, the accomplishment, which is maybe the greatest accomplishment of raising emotionally, mentally, physically healthy children that you put out into the world for the next generation. I mean, we have to survive as a species. And so that's all of that paid work is also important. And you should have the choice to do that or nurture or some of both. But if I were going to say my one goal out of this podcast would be to help people understand that we have denigrated maybe one of the most important work you can do, instead of elevating it, instead of admiring women for staying home and dealing with the boring moments and dealing with the hardships and dealing with the sleeplessness and the frustration. It's much easier to go to work. It is much easier to leave your children in daycare or with a nanny, not the women that have to, believe me. But it is much easier if you have a choice to go to work, because being out of the house it's harder work staying home. So why aren't we admiring the women who are staying home and doing that hard work and having those boring moments? So boys are neurologically more fragile than girls. More boys are born in the world and more girls survive. They don't survive because boys don't survive as much because they are incredibly neurologically fragile. Emotionally fragile too. What that means is they're more prone to aggression, behavioral problems, ADHD-like behaviors, which is distractibility. They're more sensitive to stress from a very young age. They are not the same as girls. They don't learn the same way as girls. They need lots of physical expression during the day. If they don't get it and they're forced to sit in circle time, like little girls can sit in circle time, little boys go off the rails, and then they're labeled as having attentional issues. And so we are educating little boys today like little girls, which is why they can't keep up. So if you ask me, we should separate little boys and little girls. So in terms of the neurological fragility, they need that attachment figure even more than the little girls. When it comes to going to school, maybe we should separate little boys and little girls when they're little, so we can cater to their individual needs, and it is different. And in terms of going forward, men and women are not exactly the same. And even if we try to, thousands of years of evolution are not going to be turned around in 50 years. So we may make some of these changes, but that's not realistic. What's realistic is that we functioned in a way that is based on survival for thousands, millennium. And we're going to keep functioning that way to a certain extent. There may be some people who branch off and try to do it differently. You know, the other thing is that young men today are not, they're at a disadvantage when it comes to school. And I'm going to say we need quotas. And this may sound radical, but when it comes to college, it should be 50-50. So my kids went to a school, and when it came to nursery school, they balanced the class. That means if you go to any preschool, they have half girls and half boys. That's just the way they do it. They balance it in other ways too. Alpha girls and beta girls and alpha boys. You can't have all the same kind of kid. But the idea that we have to balance the odds, otherwise marriage is also going to come to an end because of that statistic that women are only going to marry at their educational level or above. So marriage will end too.
So which girls shouldn't go though?
it's not which girls shouldn't go. It's giving boys advantage to succeed. And it's saying, you know what? We have 50% girls and 50% boys in this college, in this class. So in America, we have a lot of universities. I don't know the UK system. It's not my country. But in America, there's a lot of different places you can go. But the idea that it's like funneling, all the kids are being funneled in this way. And what I will say is that if we don't balance the odds, so girls and boys have equal opportunity in college and graduate school, we are going to have a huge social dilemma because nobody's marrying. And we have single parents. Then women are going, I can't find a man, and they're having children on their own. And that's causing a social problem because now we have little boys and little girls that don't have fathers. So all I'm saying is we need to balance the odds. That's it.
Well, you have to make more spaces because if
Maybe
60%...
maybe that's the solution.
If 60%... Because otherwise what you're saying is boys who are less academic get the places of the 10% of girls that now can't go in. So is America going to create more spaces? There's less funding,
I'm
not
not
more.
great at math, but I'll say we can have 60 and 60. I don't mind 120.
Okay.
Erica?
So I believe in freedom of choice, but not if that choice is to do harm to children. So I believe that children should always come first in our lives. Our family should always come first. Freud said you need love and meaningful work, but your love should always come first. If it's your children, if it's your spouse, if it's your parents, if it's your next door neighbors who are your best friends, love always has to come first. And so we have become a world where we put work first. And so what I would say is I believe in choice of all kind. I don't believe in demeaning or diminishing someone else's choice. If they make that choice, I'm fine with it, but don't demean or diminish my choice.